Music is down, folks. You're tuned to a public conversation on Missoula Community Access Television. And this is our last in a series that we've been running since the 11th of April, talking to many candidates for statewide as well as federal offices during this primary season. And thanks for tuning in. And we have three guests tonight. We have a GOP Senate candidate, Ed Borchard, who'll be with us in just a moment. We have Wayne Buchanan, who's running for the GOP nomination for the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And then we have a tape segment with Rick Hill, who's running for the GOP nomination for the United States House. And that interview was conducted earlier this afternoon. So we've got a full hour and a half, so I'm not going to waste too much time. I should remind folks that all of the interviews that we've been doing since early April will be, this show will be rebroadcast as customary tomorrow afternoon, but all of the interviews with 16 different candidates will be seen in a marathon showing on Saturday on MCAT and again on Sunday. So the Missoulian On TV magazine from last Sunday indicates the times and the candidates and when they'll be on the air, so stay tuned. Our first guest tonight is a man by the name of Ed Borchard, and he's from Montana originally, worked in the mines as a young man, left Montana to get his education at Stanford, where he got a BA. He worked in the mines as a young man, and he spent most of his adult life away from Montana as a business person in California. And he thinks that he's got some answers as to why he should be in the United States Senate representing Montana. So please welcome Ed Borchard. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
Welcome. You're going to get that.
Pleasure to be with you here today.
Better get that machine on, just so that.
To get my adjusted, and I think we can put it kind of right.
I should say that Ed Borchard was in the Marine Corps and served during the Korean conflict. He's been very active in Republican Party politics. You need to have that up a little bit higher, please, Ed.
A little bit higher.
Thank you. Been very heavily involved in Republican Party politics. On the Reagan campaigns, both in California, I believe, for the governorship, as well as Reagan's national runs for office successfully. And you also served as a member of the advisory committee responsible for, I guess, giving some input on how the memorial for the Korean War veterans should be appearing in Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
Well, that was, McCarthy, that was a presidential appointment. I was originally appointed by President Reagan, and I was subsequently appointed by President Bush and President Clinton. That appointment, there were 12 veterans that were appointed to of the Korean War that were appointed for the Korean War Veterans Memorial Advisory Board. And these veterans, the 12 of us, really took the responsibility for the memorial. We conducted public design competition. We selected the site. We selected the design, the concept, and the whole thing.
That's great. I know that we have a limited amount of time, so I want to concentrate on your Senate race here in Montana.
McCarthy,
I know the cost of campaigning is high. I'm surprised. How much are you spending on this campaign, the primary campaign?
Well, I think
ballpark.
We'll come in around $175,000.
And is the bulk of that, as it has been with other candidates, spent on radio and television advertising?
I think the bulk of it has been on television advertising. Yes.
On the national level, the networks, the commercial networks, as well as the public broadcasting system, have now come forward voluntarily and said they'll be supplying time for the presidential candidates on a regular basis before Election Day in the fall. In terms of looking at what you're spending and other candidates, we're spending over $1 million on radio and television in Montana in the primary season alone. Do you think that Montana commercial and public broadcasters should follow the national lead of the networks and provide some time so that citizens can get acquainted with candidates?
Yes, I do, McCarthy. You know, you have to get out you have to meet the people, particularly in a state like Montana where we have such vast geographic distances. And the medium of television is the way to really communicate. That's the most effective dollar that you can spend, but it's expensive. So when you're forced into that, you know, you have to find those dollars, and that's where special interest money comes in. And I think we'd be much better off if we had access that wasn't so expensive for the candidates.
Unlike myself, you've been in business, you know, most of your life, right? Look, from your background, a variety of experience in different corporations, housing management, major developments, California Vineyards, television production company there in California. And so you follow in the tradition of being an entrepreneur, is that right?
Yes.
And I sometimes think that in America we think of free enterprise, what's called free enterprise, and democracy as the same thing. Are they the same thing?
Well, I think in a democracy it guarantees free enterprise. Free enterprise stands for freedom of the individual. And that's what the great thing we have in this country. You're free to do things if you want to start a business. You're free to be successful. You're free to fail. In many countries in the world, you don't have that opportunity to even try. And that's the great thing about the freedom that we have in America.
Well, I assume you've employed a lot of people and at different times in California. And California tends to be, you know, generally a high-wage state. That is to say, I mean, it's a lot of technical jobs like your video enterprise or what have you. Where do you stand on both the national effort to raise the minimum wage and then the effort here in Montana to raise the minimum wage?
Well, I have great sympathy for working people. I mean, I've carried a dinner bucket and pulled a shift and in the copper mines in Butte, and I worked in lumber mills, and I'm very sympathetic to the people down at the bottom, and I think that there's no question that they can subsist on the current salary levels that they have at $4.25 an hour. I believe that it should be raised. There's no question about it. Now, there are two ways you can raise it. You can increase the wage level, but I think that just gives more money to the government to tax. I would prefer to see us first start by reducing the taxes on people in the very lowest bracket. You know, just with your FICA that is deducted every month, you pay 7.2% of your salary up to $60,000. That's a lot of money. And I think that we ought to, I would look first at reducing the tax burdens on the lower income people, and particularly the people that really work hard.
What do you, in the defense industry in particular, right, and of course I assume that you know something about that, I mean, being from California, which is a big defense industry state, and you know, I'm depending on your resume as a business person. Don't you, do you see what I seem to have seen? I mean, we talk about problems, you know, like Medicare, Medicaid problems, and you know, too many giveaways and this and that. What about corporate welfare in the United States? Haven't you seen that too, in which big business gets a lot of advantages that if you weren't big business, you wouldn't get them?
Oh, there's no question about it, and that's the special interest legislation that goes on is largely influenced by big business and by big interest groups, and they have money through PACs to give people money. I refuse to take any PAC money in my primary campaign, so nobody can accuse me of, nobody has a grip on me, and I'm not holding to anyone, at least at this point.
Well, and you talk a lot, you know, about finance and common sense in your race. You want to be in the United States Senate, and consistently over the years, you know, time in and time out, year in and year out, military budgets, cost overruns, defective products, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I mean, I read this, you know, whether that's I read it in the Wall Street Journal, or I read it in the New York Times, or I read it in the Missoulian. And yet, in this case, you know, the Republican leadership and some Democrats in the Congress, not many, but some, you know, want to add another $7 billion to the military budget. What's your take on that?
Well, I'm a military person.
Mm-hmm.
I believe in a proper military budget. I think that the first obligation of the United States is to defend this country and make sure that we can defend ourselves against all enemies. And but you know, the first thing people look at, they say, well, let's cut the defense budget, and let's put money into social programs. I think we've cut too far. I mean, we're right now. I was back in Washington a month ago. I met with the Marine Corps leaders, and they said they really don't have the capability to fight the wars that should we have a two-front war, which we've always had a capability to fight. I don't think we're prepared to fight that. But the problem is, the money that's going into the Defense Department, in my opinion, is going into the wrong areas. You know, the military is a very wonderful training ground for our citizens. And people who've had military training, they learn a technical skill, they learn a discipline, they learn good moral values, all as part of the military training. Then they come back into the civilian life, and they bring those values into civilian life.
Well, speaking of that, now you were serving at a time in the 50s when you were in the military, when there was still an active draft, and there was still an active draft when I did my service, right? Now we have an all-volunteer Army. So, compare the two. Should we continue with an all-volunteer Army, or do you believe in something like the draft or national service?
Well, I think that today we probably have the finest fighting forces that we've ever had in the history of the country, as was demonstrated by the Gulf War. And they're all volunteers, and they're, you know, you just can't, when you and I were growing up, McCarthy, we could go down and enlist in the Army. I mean, it wasn't a very big deal. If you weren't doing well in high school or something, you could, but those days are over. The GIs in the Army are handling sophisticated weapons. You know, they're worth millions and millions of dollars, each one of these missiles. So you have to have bright kids down there, and they're all graduates of high school, and I think they've done great. As for my personal opinion, I believe that the country, we're in a problem now. We don't have discipline. That's the main thing. We don't have it in our homes. We don't have it in our families, in our school systems, and we've let it get out of control. And I think that the best thing we could do would be have national service. You know, John Kennedy once said, it's not what a country can do for you, it's what you can do for your country. And I think every American, in some form, not all military, but in a civilian service, whether it's the Peace Corps or a service, but I think right out of high school, that you ought to go in for 18 months and do something for your country. I think the individuals would benefit, and I think the country would benefit.
Ed, just a few quick ones to cover some of the ground that I've covered with most of the candidates, and you know, some of them being the national, well, they're sometimes called cultural issues. I think they're more than that. Right to privacy, a woman's right to choose. Where are you on that?
Well, you know, I'm very active in the Episcopal Church, and I have been for many years. And I subscribe to my church's position, which is essentially a respect for human life. But that doesn't mean that there aren't certain circumstances where abortion isn't proper. In the case of rape or incest or the life of the mother's at stake or other special circumstances, I think that it should be carefully considered.
There's been some movement in the Republican-controlled Congress in the last couple of years to eliminate many things, but among them the national broadcasting system, that is to say the national public broadcasting system, both radio and television. It's my impression that Montanans, at least a good segment of the Montana population, relies on public radio in our far-flung distances. Do you have a take on that?
Well, McCarthy, I listen to public radio myself, and I listen to public television. And I think it's a very important part of the whole broadcast media. And I don't think that we should cut it out altogether. I think that there's a definite role for that, and I would fight to encourage that.
And let's say you pull through this primary race and you win the November election, and you're in the United States Senate, and then you had 6 years. But what's on your, in other words, what piece of legislation would you like to invent or spend your most valuable time in the United States Senate battling for or against, either getting rid of some piece of legislation that you think is fundamentally flawed, or one that you'd like to see invented, or both?
Well, let me back up just for a minute. I think when you asked me what I thought, before I ever thought about running for the United States Senate, I said, okay, Ed Borchard, when you become a United States Senator, what in fact can you contribute? What do you bring back to that body in terms of experience? And that's where I started, and I said, well, I've been a small businessman for many years. I've created a lot of jobs. I'm a veteran. I see there's a lot of need. We have over 100,000 veterans in the state of Montana. They need attention for veterans' benefits and veterans' rights. As a Marine Corps captain, I think I could contribute to something in the defense area, wherever it would apply. My greatest area of expertise is I've had a lot of foreign experience overseas in exporting U.S. agricultural products. And that has brought me in close contact with all levels of the government, and particularly the United States Senate. Over the last 15 years, I've worked extensively with the Senate Agriculture Committee and the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Foreign Trade Departments of the United States government. And I think that that's an expert that's needed. I've spent a lot of time in Asia, and you know, China is the largest country in the world. 1 of every 5 people is Chinese, and I think it's an understanding of Asia is very important.
Will you take me to China with you the next time you go?
I'd love it. But also it's important, McCarthy, for Montana, because you know our products we used to send east. But today, most of the grain that comes out of Montana, or a large portion of it, goes into the Far East.
Right.
And a lot of
So do you see more opportunity there?
I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and there's a lot of opportunity for close cooperation with Montana.
Agriculture, I mean, this was something you covered. Vermont and Kansas, they haven't passed anything yet, but both states are considering pilot programs for the growing of hemp as an industrial product. As hemp was once a very major part of the world, trade industry. And so since you spoke about agricultural products and people are always looking for new crops, is that something that's popped across your radar screen
Well, not very much, but I can tell you where I stand. I'm opposed to marijuana use.
Well, this is for the making of material, rope, shirts.
Well, I think that's a whole different question, and also I think the question of using narcotics in the medical field is an important thing that we shouldn't just shut that out. I think there's room to consider that.
And going back to the United States Senate, so what committee do you think that you would?
Well, I think I'd be qualified for
those areas?
agriculture, foreign affairs, commerce and trade, and small business and veterans. So, the Senate makes the choice of, they look at your background and determine where you'll go, but I would certainly submit my name for those 5 areas. May I just answer your question? You asked me what specific laws that I would work on immediately. I have 3 things.
Okay.
First of all, I believe that there's a lot of legislation that's passed that's on the books that's obsolete. It goes on the books and then nobody looks at it. I think that there ought to be sunset provisions in each major piece of legislation. And that means that after a certain 5, 7, 10-year period, you review that legislation. Go back to the Congress to see that the original intent was being fulfilled. The second thing is that the real problem we have is Congress passes laws. It goes to the executive branch to be implemented. And the bureaucrats make the rules over there. And sometimes when they get through their rules, it doesn't bear any resemblance to the initial legislation that was created by the Congress. And I would like to see, before any of that is implemented, that it would come back to the Congress for a review to make sure that it was in sync with the original intention of the legislation. And the next thing that I would spend time on is, I have been a student at the Stanford Business School, and I've been involved in knocking apart big conglomerates and combines. And I think we have a real problem in the business field in terms of competition and lack of, and particularly in this state. I can cite you 2 areas that I'd be interested in looking at. In agriculture, we look at the beef price at the retail level, and the price to the ranchers is down almost 40% this year. Now there's a big spread in there. The retail price has not come down that much, and I think that deserves a good look at by somebody in the United States Senate that has the courage to tackle some of these great big agricultural combines that are very, very powerful in this country and internationally. I think that's something we have to look at. And the other thing is, in the state of Montana.
Does that mean you're not a fan of Archer Daniel Midlands?
No, I'm not a fan of Archer Daniel Midland. In fact, they're an international cartel. They're not even owned in this country. Very few people know that ADM is not an American company.
I don't think I
same
knew
with
that.
ConAgra, but they're they're all over the world, and that's what we have to realize. We're in a world economy, and we have to evaluate that properly.
We have a caller. Hello, you have a question for the candidate.
Hi, I'm sorry to make you guys digress for a moment, but I had popped in and caught the question about hemp as a viable agricultural product. And the man on the air had actually sort of dodged the question, I felt, by sort of, saying that he's against narcotics.
Well, I think in deference to the candidate, he thought the question initially was about the use of marijuana as opposed to the industrial crop. But go ahead.
Well, I was just curious if he had a position on hemp as a product, not as using it to smoke, as a narcotic. I mean, that's not the issue. We're talking about a product that's viable in terms of paper pulp and things like that, instead of cutting timber or something like that for paper pulp.
All right, thanks. You want to hang on and wait for the answer, or?
Yeah, I sure would.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to confuse the issue. I certainly think that there are proper industrial uses. I mean, for hemp, and I don't mean to confuse that.
Right.
The industrial use is as opposed to the narcotic side of it, and I want to make that quite clear.
Any more? Hello?
Yeah, hi. Okay, sure. I still didn't really hear a clear answer on that. I mean, where does he stand in terms of using hemp as a substitute for a paper pulp industry versus old-growth timber?
Oh, I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
If it's scientifically proven that that's an acceptable practice and a good industrial use, I have no problem with that at all.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. Where were we?
Well, we were talking about sunset legislation.
Right, good.
And we talked about implementation of antitrust laws to break up some of the big monopolies. And I mentioned that I think that there's something to look at in the cattle industry in Montana. But also, we have a terrible railroad problem here.
Yes.
We have one railroad, essentially, the Burlington Northern.
Yes.
And you know that you can ship a carload of grain from Omaha, Nebraska to the export markets in Portland from Omaha cheaper than you can from any point in Montana. And Montanans wheat farmers are held hostage to the rates of the Burlington Northern Railroad. And it's a monopoly, clear and simple. And I think that it's time we had somebody at the Senate level who had enough courage to take these things on. And I've had experience in doing that, and I would relish that opportunity.
Interesting. Just another Montana, issue near and dear, or near and something to most Montanans, the right to keep and bear arms. What about the vote? Now we've got assault weapons banned as well. Is that something that you would let stand, or that you would like to go back?
Well, I'd like to go back and abolish it. First of all, let me tell you my position on gun control. I'm a member of the NRA. I believe in the right to bear arms, and I'm a Marine Corps captain. So I'm an infantry captain. I know how the proper use of, I believe in education, teaching our young people how to use arms properly. And that's where we are on that issue. In terms of assault weapons, I've been to a number of gun shows during this campaign. There's all kinds of assault weapons. And I can tell you as an infantry officer that you can take any kind of a semi-automatic weapon, and you can take it to an armor and file it down, and you can make it into an assault weapon. There are weapons coming into this country today, guns that come from China and Russia that we can't control, but they're so easy to make into assault weapons. You just cannot, it's like prohibition. I don't think you can really effectively enforce any kind of a ban like that. And I know it sounds good, assault weapons is a horrible name, and to ban them sounds good, but the practical effect of it is that law really doesn't make a lot of sense.
Ed, we've only got a few minutes left. I wish we had longer. but I'd let you finish up with any particular points that you wanted to make, but I had one or two other questions. I think we're all have acknowledged that Montana, quote, boasts one of the largest Superfund cleanup sites in the country, and that's, you know, our stream and valley coming all the way down from Butte all the way down to Missoula. We got a Superfund Cleanup Act. Of course, it's been around for many years. Lots of litigation. The state of Montana, ARCO. I mean, it goes on around the country. But you know, all right, whatever. Superfund, no Superfund, litigation, no litigation. I assume that all of us would like to clean the poison up. Have you given any thought to cutting through the morass that surrounds these kinds of things? In other words, like, how would you clean it up?
Well,
you know, I mean, let's say you'd be in the Senate and the Superfund thing is up for renewal, etc. Do you, as an experienced, you know, entrepreneur, what do you see there?
Well, I think we have to clean it up.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any question about that. And I think we have to have clean water, particularly in Montana, and we have to have the right environment here. Mining practices of many years ago were very different than they are today, but I think we've made a lot of strides. But I certainly believe in going forward and cleaning up the messes that are there, and there wouldn't be any question about that.
So until we have a different model, then corporations and tax dollars are going to have to do the job.
I think that that's right.
Well, I'll let you wrap it up, and before you do, I thank you for coming over, and as I've said to all the candidates that have come over, thanks for running, and I hope it's been an enjoyable campaign for you. And
well, McCarthy, it's been a great experience. Win, lose, or draw, this has been a wonderful thing for me. I've had my daughter here, who's been my campaign manager. We've had time together to visit virtually every part of this state, which is so magnificent. I mean, I was born and raised here. I'm a third generation, but I've seen things I've never seen before. And I think we're just all privileged to live in Montana, and I'm committed to protect this great natural beauty that we have. I'm in this race, first of all, because I'm a businessman. I'm not a politician. And people that vote for me shouldn't, it's not more of the same. I think politicians go back there and they say something good at the candidate level, but they get back there inside the Beltway and you know, they just get all taken apart. I'm old enough and I've had enough experience. I'm not going there for the money or for the retirement. I just want to do the job. I've done tough things all my life, and I'm ready to really hammer away at it. I'm very concerned that we have the strongest nation in the world, the greatest economy in the world, and yet we're broke. And I think you need a businessman that's had experience to go back there and make some tough decisions that's going to put this thing back on track. And that's the main reason I'm running. The second thing is I've watched Max Baucus for 18 years in the Senate. I don't think that he represents Montana. He's not in touch with Montana or Montana values. I mean, he says one thing and does another. His money does not come from Montana. It comes from special interest groups, and he spends most of his time creating special legislation for Wall Street and for Hollywood. And I think that's reprehensible. I think you need a senator from Montana who will address the problems of agriculture. For example, the beef price and the railroad monopoly we have here. We have tremendous problems here, as well as we need to introduce new industry into this state that will bring some high-paying jobs. Montana has one of the lowest per capita incomes in the United States. It's $17,500
I'll vouch
a
for
year.
that.
And it's terrible. I mean, we're number 48 out of 50. We're below Arkansas. And I think that we have to improve the business climate here. We have to get some decent paying jobs for people in this state. I know how to do that working at the federal level, and that would be one of the main objectives that I'd have, is getting Montana. And you know, when you have economic activity and you have good jobs, the tax rate goes down for people. And Montanans are terribly overtaxed today, and the best way to do it is to come forward with new high-paying technical jobs that meet our environmental requirements.
Great. Thanks for being here at Borchard, and best of luck with the campaign and with your life.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, thanks. We'll play musical chairs with Wayne Buchanan, who's in for a little interview.
Great.
And make sure you get your clip off so that you... That's great. That's fine. Thanks again, Ed. All right. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much for coming in. And we're welcoming Wayne Buchanan. He's a Republican candidate for the nomination to run for Superintendent of Public Instruction, a pretty significant statewide elected position in Montana, now held by Nancy Keenan, a Democrat.
Yes.
And Nancy's on her second term now, isn't that correct?
Right, she'll be seeking her third term.
Second term, and the Superintendent of Public Instruction. Briefly, Wayne Buchanan, what's the Superintendent of Public Instruction in charge of?
Superintendent of Public Instruction is in charge of enforcing the rules passed by the Board of Public Education. The Superintendent of Public Instruction is also the Chief State School Officer, and as such, she receives federal funds. She's responsible for distributing the state money that goes to education, and then there are other ministerial duties assigned to the
Right.
superintendent as well.
Right. I'm just curious, have you yourself have you made your position known on this Regents legislative referendum, whereby we're going to be voting on the November ballot as to whether to retain the Regents in their present form as it's written up in the state constitution, or whether the Regents will be subsumed and placed under the aegis of the Department of Public Education? Is that
It would create a Department of Public Education under the governor.
right? And where are you on that one?
Well, as you may remember, there were two bills in the last legislature, House Bill 229 and House Bill 228. House Bill 229 had to do with the Regents and abolishing the Regents as a constitutional authority. And 228 would have abolished my board, the Board of Public Education. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Board of Public Education. So this would get rid of the...
Is that an appointed job or a...
That is an appointed job.
Okay.
And so we were, as you know, the one to put the Regents and to abolish the Regents and create the Department of Education passed, and the one to abolish the Superintendent of Public Instruction, the Board of Public Education, failed.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the first thought I have is that relief that we aren't facing the axe in
Right.
November. I think, but I really think that the public is not going to be happy with a Department of Education. I think creating a large bureaucracy out of three small bureaucracies is not going to be a good way to, we're not going to be happy with that either. Mm-hmm. If they think that the Regents are unresponsive now, wait until they they become a large bureaucracy under the governor. And I think people will find they have less control now, or I mean then, than they do have now.
Well, I do have to chip in certainly a viewpoint that I've held for several months now, going back in time. But if the Regents, and myself, I'd prefer to keep the constitutional status of the Regents, but I do have the opinion, and it's no secret, that it seems to me the Regents, if they don't want to, be subsumed into some other board, they need to clean up their act a little bit, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think anybody in Missoula was particularly thrilled over the land dealings that have been going on. As they say, ignorance of the law is no excuse, and the Attorney General's report was pretty specific, even though he was gentlemanly about it. I don't think, it was a pretty exhaustive report, and the Regent's attorney's reaction was, those matters are of, quote, dubious legal concern, close quote from Leroy Schramm. Attendance records of some of the appointed regents have not been good at all. So I just needed to get that out. Why do you want to be superintendent of public instruction? What is it that you don't like about the way business and education goes on now, and what would make you deserving of that office?
Well, I have felt for a number of years that the present superintendent of public instruction really isn't interested in being superintendent of public instruction. She hasn't been an active superintendent of public instruction. We find that the solutions to education that ought to be coming from her office don't. And I can give you a number of examples of that. Just 2 sessions ago, in 1993.
Excuse me, and this is, I should apologize to the audience because I have not done sufficient homework on you yourself, but I would ask, before you lay on to Nancy Keenan, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be in this appointed position anyway? Could you fill us in on
Sure.
What have you been doing all your life?
Well, I was raised in Missoula.
Yeah.
I moved here with my parents in 1948 as a little shaver. Lived, as a matter of fact, not very far from here. What I thought was interesting when I came in this room, I used to sit in this very room and box my papers when it was the old Missoulian
building, right.
And I went to the University of Montana. I have 2 degrees from the University of Montana. I was a teacher, an English teacher, for 8 years.
Where was that?
I taught for a short while in Wyoming, and then I came back to Montana, and the last 4 years I taught in Conrad. After that, I went to work for the School Boards Association as the assistant executive director.
That's the Montana School
Boards Association. Right. And I worked with school boards for 3 years as the assistant exec. And then I was appointed the executive director of the School Boards Association, and I was there for 7 years.
They're kind of a lobbying organization, as it were, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Right. And I think but they're responsible also for providing training for school board members. They're an advocacy group. They try to look out for the interests of school boards and local control, primary guardians of local control, I think, in the state of Montana.
So you worked for them for a few years.
Worked for them for a few years, and then I decided that for 10 years altogether. And then I decided I would go back to school, and sort of my midlife crisis, I went back to the University of Virginia. I spent 3 years at the University of Virginia, wonderful years, missing Montana all the time, even though Charlottesville is a lovely place to go to school. But I was there for 3 years, came back. I earned my doctorate in education policy and leadership and law, attended the University of Virginia Law School at the same time. And then I came back to Montana, and they had an opening for the executive secretary of the State Board of Public Education, and I have been there 6 years.
6 years. And so so you apply for that job, but when I use the word appointed, it's not, how does that translate, appointed?
Well, I was hired just as...
I mean, it's not a political appointment.
No, it's not a political
appointment. The way some jobs are,
no.
That you still apply for them, but then it's an appointment by the governor or somebody.
No, it is an appointment by the board.
I see.
The board is a 7-member board. It's made up like the regents.
Right.
Appointed by the governor. And then the Board of Public Education hires their own executive.
Okay.
Just as the Board of Regents hires its own executive, and that's the Commissioner of Higher Education, and I'm the Executive Secretary of the Board of Public Education.
And what does that board do? What's it supposed to do?
The function of the board there really has 3 main responsibilities. The first is to set the school accreditation standards for Montana. The board also sets the licensure requirements, the certification requirements for teachers, and the board also accredits the teacher training institutions or the teacher training schools in Montana.
Okay. And okay, so you've been in. So that's the slot you're still in.
Yes.
Right now, and you're not happy with the way Nancy Keenan has done her job, and you were going down that path.
Well, I started to give you the example of the fact that we knew that we had an unconstitutional system of financing education in Montana. We knew that in 1989. And for 4 years, Nancy Keenan refused to present a program to make our unconstitutional system constitutional. So in the legislature, went to the legislative auditor in great frustration. And the legislative auditor put into effect House Bill 667, which equalized funding in Montana. But the problem is that it had an automatic feature in that bill that if the state failed to fund its fair share, that this automatically went back on local property taxes and on local property taxpayers. And but once again, a decision, a major policy change in in Montana was fashioned outside of education, and it should have been fashioned inside of education. The superintendent has clearly the best people in school finance that the state has to offer. That's one example. I can give you another of them. Nancy Keenan is a...
Let me shift ground and,
Sure.
and try and put it back on you. And let's say you get through this primary, you beat your opponents in the primary, and you go on to the general election, and you're the superintendent of public instruction in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been around the school system in Montana a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And what could people expect to visibly see differently about that department because you were the head of it? What you know, whether that's a dramatic change in this or that or the other thing, what, you know, other than anyway, that's it.
Well, one of the things you're going to notice is an office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Office of Public Instruction. It's going to be a lot smaller under my administration than it is under Nancy's. The Superintendent of Public Instruction raised the size of that office, the present superintendent, from around 108 people under, or 104 under Ed Argenbright, up to 140 people. She has, in the last biennium, she had a budget of $5 million for that department. Well, when you have 140 people, McCarthy, if you think about this, for a state the size or the population of Montana, you have 140 people, then you're going to have those folks looking for things to do. And I'll give you one guess where they're going to find those things to do. They're in the local schools. And I believe that we need to really not just talk about local control, but really depend upon local control. If we're going to have better education, it's not going to happen at the state level. It's going to happen at the level of the local school districts, the local classroom with teachers. And this is the way we're going to make things better, not by having a bigger Department of Education.
Are you a supporter of school vouchers?
I don't think that vouchers are probably going to be an issue in Montana. We have not only the national constitutional prohibition, but we have a state prohibition as well. Mm-hmm. I do expect to see, however, some form of participation in the in private schools by with public money. I think there are a number of plans out there now. One of them in the last legislature was by Representative Borchard, and this would have provided an income tax tuition waiver. So I would say that we'll see something like that. And I think we've got some good plans out there, and we have some bad ones. And
Were you, Wayne? We've got about 2 minutes, and I'm still going to hit you with a couple of quickies. And
sure.
Thanks for coming down, and I'm glad that we were able to work out this schedule.
So am I.
The Goals 2000 money that the legislature effectively refused,
Yes.
which was several millions of dollars. Where were you on that one?
Well, I have always felt that if I'm not in favor of a big bureaucracy at the state level, I'm sure as heck not in favor of one at the national level. I don't think we ought to be taking federal money for education. I don't think if we think that we're getting free money from the feds, we're just fooling ourselves. We never have.
Does that include things like school lunch programs and?
You know, I think that I think this is one of the things we can point to as being wrong. We have become dependent upon the federal government, and would I throw out these programs? Of course not. We now depend on them, and that's the very point that I would like to make. We can't. The federal involvement in education is wrong, and this is why the founders left education to the states.
Would you see would that kind of sentiment that I hear extend to things like money for projects that appear in the public schools in Montana through such things as the Montana Committee for the Humanities and the Montana Arts Council, which do receive federal funds, but then the Humanities and the Arts Council go out in the public schools in Montana? Is that another thing that you would want to see X'd out in terms of federal?
I can't speak on those things. I mean, I don't know enough about them to speak on those things.
Yeah.
But I do feel that federal involvement in schools is wrong, and they have not fixed Goals 2000 by allowing school districts to go directly to the federal government for those funds. It would be nice to have the money, but I don't think that we ought to get it from the federal government.
Wayne Buchanan, you're running for Superintendent of Public Instruction in Montana. I thank you for coming down. I wish we had longer, but we do not.
You have about 2.5 more minutes if you want to take a phone call.
Well, we have. Hello, you have a question or?
Hi.
Hiya.
I just wanted to talk about the OPI for a little bit.
We've got about 2 minutes, so make it quick, please.
Okay, I just find that every aspect of the OPI is vital, and it's a really fragile organization. I mean, in 1986, last time it was checked, only 2/3 of the casework of the OPI was even addressed. So it seems to me almost understaffed. I was just curious as to what parts of the OPI you wanted to cut and why.
All right, thank you.
Well, I don't know what he means by the casework of OPI, and that I don't understand that term, and I don't recognize that as being but of course, assuming that there is something we call casework with OPI, the question is, what does that casework do? What does it contribute to the schools in Montana? And then I would ask this gentleman to go back and check with the teachers in the schools, check with the administration, and ask them, what has OPI done for you that you really consider to be important? And I think that you're not going to find, you're going to run across the occasional individual that has used the curriculum services of OPI and some of the other things, those service-oriented things that OPI does. And I think that with 100 people in that office, surely you can do those kinds of service things. If there are a lot of areas, and we don't have time to go into it now, but there are a lot of areas that OPI shouldn't be involved in. And we need to take a look at those things, and we need to eliminate them. For 8 years, Ed Argenbright ran that office with about 100 people, or a few more or less. And I didn't hear a lot of complaints coming from the schools, and I was in Montana during those years. People saying, gosh, I wish there were more people working for OPI.
Well, actually, I mean, perhaps maybe the average, the mainstream, the white male students in our school system, they can say, well, OPI doesn't benefit me, but what about the disabled, the resource students? I think those are the people who really are benefiting from the OPI, excuse me.
Well,
But are those people going to be surveyed as well, or whatnot?
Well, I think that this is one of the valid functions of OPI, but I don't think that we could get into mainstreaming and inclusion and a whole bunch of subjects that touch on what you've talked about, and that would be another.
Are you trying to keep these people down?
Pardon?
Are we trying to keep these people down?
Of course not. Of course not. But the question we need to answer is whether or not these people are being well served in the schools today, and I think I could make a case that they are not being well served.
On that note, caller, I'm sorry, but we've got to go to a tape segment. Yeah. Thanks a lot for calling in. I wish we had more time.
Yeah, silence me.
No, we're switching to an earlier interview.
Silence me. It's establishment keeping me down.
All right, thank you. And thanks very much for coming in, Wayne.
Well, McCarthy, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. Excuse me. And it was nice to see the
Fresh Missoula
lilacs,
lilacs.
and that's one of the things, my fondest memories of this town.
Great.
Thank you
Thanks
very
a lot.
much.
And now we're going to a taped interview with the GOP House candidate Rick Hill. And that video will be running in just a second, as soon as the directors, and thanks everybody on the crew for volunteering once again. You've been very patient during this 2-month series. Are we ready with that tape? Okay, thank you. Well, welcome, Rick Hill, GOP candidate for the nomination to the United States House of Representatives. You've been moving through Montana Republican government circles for a long time, getting involved with the rehabilitation effort on the Workmen's Compensation Fund in Montana, and you've been very active in the Republican Party. You were, what's the title, Executive Director of the party?
State Chairman.
State Chairman of the party. And you've, of course, campaigned for Mark Roscoe, and you've campaigned for Conrad Burns, among other things. And now you're taking on this race for the U.S. House. You have 2 primary opponents, is that correct?
That's right.
And how much money are you spending on this race?
I don't know the exact number, but somewhere around $230,000 to $250,000
On the primary race, right.
Yeah, that'd be about right, I think.
Right. And let's say you pull it off, and then you get the nomination and you win the race in the fall, and you're in the House of Representatives. What is the one piece of legislation, if you had a 2-year term and you wanted your name attached to a piece of national legislation, what
would
is
that
it?
be? The Citizens Congress Act, to take the Congress away from the special interests and give it back to the people. That would change campaign finance laws, that would get rid of automatic pay raises, would get rid of the pensions, these outrageous pensions that Congress pays itself, trim back the franking privilege, to re-level the playing field, if you will, between challengers and incumbents.
Mm-hmm. Do you support a continued public funding of the presidential campaign?
I'm not opposed to that. I am not in favor of public funding of congressional campaigns or U.S. Senate campaigns.
And does that include, I'm always amazed that taxpayers are footing the bills for the Republican and the Democratic conventions.
Yeah, I am a little surprised at that too. You know, let me tell you what I think the problem is here. Is that public funding of presidential campaigns, of course, came in during the Watergate era when there was clearly concern about the abuse of money, large sums of money. And I shared that concern then, and I share it now. The problem that we have is that taxpayers are footing the bill to tens of millions of dollars for these presidential campaigns, and the quality of the presidential campaigns hasn't improved. And so public funding of political campaigns isn't going to give us a higher quality political campaign. All it's doing is shifting the burden from people, the interested citizens, to the broader base of taxpayers.
On the national level, the 3 major networks plus Fox and the public broadcasting system have announced their plans to provide free time for candidates to present themselves in the national elections. Yet the greatest amount of money that's spent on campaign advertising is spent on the local and the state level. Have you, or do you intend to, or have you heard any discussions amongst candidates? When are you folks going to be calling on Montana commercial and public broadcasters to follow the national network lead in providing time for people to run for Congress?
It's something that we haven't done yet, but I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea that it be done voluntarily. I'm not a
Well, the national networks did it on a voluntary basis.
I think, though, that partially came as a consequence of some efforts that are out there that would have mandated that. I think that there are campaign finance reform
Right, they felt the
proposals.
pressure, and so they did
Sure,
something.
exactly.
Well, I mean,
But we certainly work every day at trying to gain access to the public through the media, and we will certainly, in the general election, sit down with our opponents. We will have two and talk about that.
And of the amount of money you said, a couple hundred, 250,000 you're spending on this primary campaign, how much of that would be on television and radio advertising, more or less?
Probably 150 of that,
Yeah,
160
so
of it. The
well
lion's share
over
of it.
half.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right. And you're a balanced budget supporter,
Yes, I am. you
right?
bet.
And as
Both
a,
the amendment and the plan to balance the budget.
and as a balanced budget supporter, then now in Montana, Montana citizens, we pay less in federal taxes than we get in federal benefits. So would your approach to the balanced budget mean that that would no longer be true? I mean, how do you, what's your take on that philosophically? Montanans are certainly seem to be delighted when they receive, you know, more than they put in.
Well, McCarthy, the problem is every congressman can go home and say, I'm bringing home more than you're paying in, because, of course, the nation is spending more than it's taking in. And people have come to realize that you can't go on doing that forever. I mean, let's remember that when you deficit spend, it isn't as though you're escaping paying for that. You're just shifting it to the next generation of taxpayers, the next generation of Montanans. So nobody's walking away here. There are no free lunches.
Right,
in,
but
in
would you, I
government
mean,
either.
I'm asking other candidates this, but I mean, who bites the bullet? I mean, in other words, with that setup, we're getting more than we pay in. Are you ready to bite the bullet and say, you know, we're not entitled to that?
I'm ready to cut spending across the board. Montana's spending is going to go down in Montana. I don't know how that's going to pan out with regard to how much Montanans pay in taxes or they don't. That's not how the system is set up, McCarthy. I mean, let me just make the point here, and that is that one of the reasons that Montanans don't pay as much in taxes as we receive in benefits is the fact that the average income in Montana is so substantially lower than the national average. If we earned at the average of what the nation is, we probably wouldn't receive more than we pay in taxes. So I'm not concerned about that relationship. What I am concerned about is the nation can't go on spending more than it takes in. We are on the verge of a financial calamity, and we have to stop that.
Well, when I read the press talking about budgets and money, you know, you could take another rap at the Democrats on another ground, but you're a Republican, so I'll rap on you. The Republicans always seem very eager to spend a lot of federal tax dollars on the defense budget. They want to, you know, the Republicans in the Congress want to add $7 billion to the Defense Department, and I don't get it.
Well, the first priority of the nation is to provide for the common defense, to protect our borders. And so I think that all of us, Republicans and Democrats, are committed to making sure that we have an adequate national defense. The level of our commitment as a portion of our national income today for national defense is at the level it was in 1938, which left us very unprepared for World War II. I think that there's a serious concern out there whether or not we are adequately committed to our national defense. I think that there's a question out there. Are we living in a safer world, or are we living in a more hazardous world? I don't believe we're living in a safer world than we were 6 years ago or 5 years ago. So I think we need to be concerned about it.
So you're interested in spending some of that extra Defense Department money on things like the Star Wars initiative?
I certainly think that we should have a missile defense program, which was part of the original strategic defense proposal. I do think we ought to do that. I think that we're in a situation today where we have 20 to 30 nations that are going to be in possession of nuclear weapons and the delivery device for them. And not all those nations are nations with which we have even the ability to enter into a dialogue. So I'm concerned about that, and I think a missile defense system is something that ought to be in on the drawing board. Now, I'm not going to tell you at this point I think we ought to spend more money on national defense. I think that we've got some real serious problems with regard to procurement and how we fund R&D. And so I think that there are ways for us to get savings out of that to help fund some other defensive initiatives.
How do you see that happening? I mean, in other words, all my life, you know, most of the time when I read about procurement policies, you've got a defense industry establishment which is making billions and billions and billions of dollars on cost overruns and you know, products that don't work, including fighter planes and things like that. I don't see anybody biting the bullet on the national scene and saying, I'm going to go in there and clean that up. I think my impression of it is that the industry, the money-making industry who are producing the weapons are very glad to have cost overruns. And I don't see anybody in Washington, biting the bullet on this.
Well, I won't agree with you that there isn't anybody there.
Well,
there's no question
right.
in my view that we have to be responsible for how every dollar of tax dollar gets paid. And if we don't believe the Defense Department or the Commerce Department or the Interior Department is spending the dollars appropriately, as a congressman, it's your responsibility to do everything you can to change that. Now, clearly, as you and I both know, that there are special committees, armed services committees in both houses are the people where that accountability lies and where that kind of interaction with the Defense Department has to take place. But I can tell you, so far as I'm concerned, I'm going to work in every way that I can to make sure that we're spending defense dollars just as appropriately as we spend every other dollar.
Well, and another example, the CIA with its misplaced $4 billion, budgets that are buried in secrecy. How do you feel about that as an individual citizen and as a Republican? I don't like it.
Yeah, I can tell you that one of the things that I learned a great deal working with the Roscoe administration is that government can operate with full disclosure. And so I'm a big fan of full disclosure. Now, obviously, the intelligence area is an area that has some certain sensitivity associated with it, and we have to recognize that. But the idea that the American people don't know how much money is spent in intelligence is wrong. And I think that there's a lot more information could be made available to the public, ought to be made available to the public, and I'm all for that.
Yeah, well, I keep wondering, well, when I read the press, the $4 billion that the CIA has in its accounts is misplaced. There's been no explanation of the misplacement of it. And I obviously, I don't know daily what goes on in the Congress, but I'm astonished at that. I'm astonished, and I'm astonished that candidates as well as office holders, they raise hell about Whitewater, or they raise hell about any, one of, 20 or 30 things. But, I don't see people coming forward and saying, let's get to the bottom of this. The secrecy thing is a nice cover for misplacing $4 billion.
Yeah. Let me tell you this, McCarthy. I learned from being in business. My father was in business, and I inherited an entrepreneurialism from him. I've been in business myself, started a business from scratch. And one of the things I learned in business is that if you keep track of the nickels and the dimes, the dollars tend to take care of themselves. And I think that's one of the problems in Congress. I hear people in Congress say, well, that program's only $5 million, or that program's only $10 million, or only $50 million, as if that's not a lot of money. And I think that we have to be accountable for every dollar we spend, and we have to make sure that one of the problems that I find with government at all levels is that oftentimes government isn't concerned with its effectiveness. It's just concerned with getting done, hiring the people, or going through the process. And we need to hold people accountable for the effectiveness of every program. And I don't have any favorites there. I'm very committed to our national defense, but I'm not going to say that we don't hold the Defense Department accountable or any other department. I think you hold them all accountable.
Are you going to be on a debate over Montana Public Radio?
Thursday night.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And I assume you welcome that opportunity.
Oh, sure.
Okay. So let's look at the national public broadcasting situation then. That's under attack by Republican Congress. They many want to eliminate it entirely, or cut it back severely. You, like many people, will be on Montana Public Radio. How do you square the difference there? Are you a supporter of public broadcasting?
I've already had this question asked to me on Yellowstone Public Radio, and my answer to that is that I think that public radio can be self-sustaining. I'm not opposed to public radio, but my view is that we have to set priorities with regard to what we're going to do with the money, because we don't have enough money to provide for all the needs that we have in this country. And so if we're going to balance the budget, we're going to have to start setting priorities. If National Public Radio, which I think it can, be supported without public tax dollars, then it ought to occur. Now, does that mean you chop them off and leave them hanging? No, I think you have to put together a plan to fully privatize that, or to have it supported by means other than taxpayer dollars.
Right.
And I would favor that.
So then let's say then all candidates, let's say, using the facility of Montana Public Radio maybe would pay for their time on
We
it.
do it for every other, access to every other media outlet. We pay
Except,
for our time.
well, you're on one, in
that's
which
right.
you're not,
Yeah.
you're not paying
Sure.
anything.
Yeah, you are correct about that.
And are you, you're a candidate, what, are you pro-choice or right to life? Where are you on that?
I'm pro-life, right to
You're
life.
pro-life, and do you, are you expecting to go to the Republican convention this year?
I haven't even thought about
Mhm.
that. My guess is that I won't go. but-
Do you think that the plank on pro-life should be changed, altered, enlarged? I
No.
mean, there's a lot.
No,
you
I'm
wanna
comfortable with the plank where
keep
is.
keep it the way it is, and the right to keep and bear arms. You're a supporter of
Yes,
that
I am.
amendment, right? And does that? Are you? Where do you stand on assault weapons?
Assault-style weapons. The ban on semi-automatic weapons, commonly called the assault-style weapons, I would vote to repeal that. And the reasoning for that is that it doesn't do anything. This law, it isn't going to do anything to diminish violence in our society. Our problem isn't guns, McCarthy. Our problem is violence in the society. And as long as we have a society that encourages and welcomes and cheers violence, we're going to have violence in our society. And so I think we need to go after the real problem. The real problem is violence.
And labor unions generally oppose right-to-work laws. Are you a supporter or an opponent of right-to-work laws?
Where the debate is on a national level, I'll take you through this whole issue, but where the debate is on a national level right now is whether or not there should be a national right-to-work law or whether we should leave states to make that decision on their own. I support allowing states to make that decision on their own, so that's where I would be. I think that Montana, this is an issue that has roiled Montanans for a long time, and I think if it's going to be resolved, it ought to be resolved by putting it on the ballot and let people vote, say one way or another how they want to have it.
Do you like the initiative and referendum process in Montana?
Yes, I do.
And do you think that, what do you think about that on a national level?
Difficult to administer on a national level, but certainly we have this pent-up frustration with Washington, because I think the majority of Americans, I know the majority of Montanans, don't believe that their congressional delegation is always responsive to them, and certainly they don't believe that the Congress is responsible to them. So the idea that you could do that with referendum is something that appeals to me. I have some concerns about, and it's not an issue I've spent a lot of time thinking about, but I have some concerns about constitutional amendments by initiative on a national level. I think that we have to be very careful and very slow and thoughtful when we start amending the Constitution, and so that would give me some concern. But the idea of referendum for other initiatives, I think is something that I could support.
And gay rights, where are you on that?
Well, my view on rights for any special interest group is that we shouldn't have special sets of rights for any group of people. I'm not a fan of set-asides and entitlement programs for people simply because they fit one class or another.
Did you think
and that would apply to gay
Do
and
you think the
homosexual
U.S.
people.
Supreme Court made a right decision last week when they found the Colorado amendment to be unconstitutional on its face?
I can't address that because I don't know all the
Okay.
ramifications of that decision, so I really can't address it.
Hard rock mining, decades-long controversy over whether hard rock miners really pay enough for the rights to the minerals that they gather. Vastly out of proportion as I look at it. What's your take on that?
Well,
Should they be paying more for the right to take valuable minerals out of the state of Montana?
Well, we have to talk about who owns those minerals. What you're alluding to, I think, is where those have been patented mining claims on public lands. And I favor reforms that would put some sort of royalty on that, and also I support reforms that would return that land to the public land after the mining activity is gone. So now the exact degree of that is something that there are all kinds of different proposals out there, and I would evaluate. Some people want to direct that money to cleaning up of hazardous sites. Others would want to direct it to the state treasury. Some would want to direct it to the federal treasury. Those are all some issues that still remain open in my mind.
And on these 3 or 4 major mining endeavors and proposals that we've got now in Montana, the one near Yellowstone Park, 7-Up Pete Lincoln, the one in western Montana out in the Cabinets, You know, a lot of concern in Montana about those mining operations. What's your take on those?
Well, we have a process, as you know, in Montana that requires that for the siting of a mine, an assessment be done of all the environmental risks associated with that activity. And before a mine can proceed, all those environmental risks, all those environmental hazards have to be presented and dealt with in any plan to conduct mining. And I think that that's a good process. It's a scientific process rather than an emotional process. It requires people to deal with all the issues that are raised, that are considered environmental hazards, environmental risks, impacts on communities, and I think that that's a good process. If in the end, the companies who want to engage in mining can satisfy all those concerns, then they're allowed to proceed with a permit. And of course, as you know, that permit is not only a state permit, but they have to get usually several federal permits in the process as well. I think that's a good process because it's based upon total community participation, it's based upon science rather than emotion, and it deals with all the hazards. Bottom line for me is that if those mining activities can be conducted in a way that protects and conserves the environment, then I think they ought to go forward, and if they can't, then they shouldn't.
And grazing fees on public lands, been another controversial issue amongst, you know, throughout the West. Do you think there are any inequities that exist now?
Sure there are, and as you probably are aware, the Federal Range Management Act that passed the Senate, and I think has come out of the committee in the House, but has not yet passed on the floor of the House. I get campaigning as much as I do, I don't always get to maintain the reading, would base those fees on a formula and raise those fees by about 35%. And I think most people believe that that would create an equitable comparison with private grazing, given the differences that those people who do graze on public lands have with regard to the maintaining fences and water supplies and that sort of thing. And I think that that's a fairly good piece of legislation. It involves both recreationists and grazing interests in terms of making management decisions with regard to how that land is going to be managed, so that consideration is given not only to grazing, but also the multiple use of the land.
Superfund. And as you know, we have one of the largest, if not the largest, Superfund cleanup site in the United States. And it's been in litigation for many years between the state of Montana and ARCO. And I think it's generally agreed that Montanans are unhappy with that waste site. We have long memories in the state. We know that you know, waste came from, you know, going back 100 years. What about the Superfund?
Well, as you know, the Superfund gives us the kind of problem that we've had in Montana, where we've litigated.
Well, is that the state litigating, or is that the private sector litigating, essentially?
Well, whenever you set up a process where there are no incentives for people to reach agreement, you're going to have people avoid reaching agreement. And Superfund is set up that way. There are serious problems with regard to retroactive liability for people who didn't have a direct interest in creating the problem. Big problem with joint and several liability. It allows people who created the principal problem to litigate to try to draw others in order to lay off, if you will, part of their responsibility. And that's just not working. And that's why we're spending billions of dollars on litigation rather than billions of dollars of cleaning up sites. I think we need to make changes, particularly for small businesses, people who weren't directly involved with the site, limiting joint and several liability, and that works both ways. It gets them out of the issue. It gets government out of trying to put the blame there. It also gets the primary source polluter, the people who really created the problem, clearly in a situation where they're responsible. I do not favor changes that would take responsibility away from those people who created the problem, even if they were in compliance with the law at the time. But I do think we have to change this law, or we're not going to get things done. After all, our interest as a country is getting that cleaned up. I mean, that's your interest and that's my interest. Our second interest is to make sure that the people who created the problem pay for the cleanup. But the first priority ought to be getting it cleaned up, and that's where our tax dollars are going, and we ought to be focusing the use of those tax dollars on cleanup rather than litigation.
What, do you think the government, in the federal government or the state government or the local government, should be able to censor speech and the work of artists?
Well, I think I'm a strong advocate of the First Amendment, both regard to expression of artists as well as expressions of faith or points of view. When public facilities are used, then the government has some responsibility and some authority to limit what's displayed or what's expressed. Particularly if by some association it's interpreted that that's an expression or the view of the people in the public sector. But as far as you as an artist or any other artist who wants to privately display or have a gallery and display your artwork, you ought to have full freedom to do that. If children are exposed to obscene things, I mean, I think that government has both the right and a responsibility to protect children and other groups from being exposed to things that they don't need to or shouldn't be exposed to. But I'm very much in favor of people having full expression.
And would your take earlier in which you thought that public broadcasting should be self-supporting, does that also include the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Committee for the Humanities and how that would affect Montana as well?
Yes, I think eventually they should be. I think that there should be a phasing in of make them self-sustaining.
Mm-hmm. And how would you imagine them to be self-sustaining?
Well, as you know today,
Tickets?
You can use tickets, you can use advertising, the ways other groups are self-sustaining. I mean, let's keep in mind that government supports those institutions two ways today. One of the ways it supports those institutions is with direct appropriation of money. The second way that it supports those organizations is by allowing tax deduction for contributions to those organizations. I'm all in favor of retaining the tax deductibility of contributions to those organizations. I see that Bob Dole is proposing even tax credits to encourage people to make charitable contributions. So there are lots of other ways, more indirect ways, that you can encourage public to support those organizations. And perhaps, like every other public entity, maybe they can trim their budgets a little bit as well. I mean, I do think that we're in a situation today where businesses and institutions such as this one right here, and our universities and our schools and our city and county governments, state, federal government, are all having to try to find ways to be more effective, get more done with less. And I suspect the National Endowment of the Arts and Humanities and National Public Radio could do the same.
And I mean, you've been actively, in the state environment for many years now, and have you taken any position on any of the initiatives that have been, moving through the works here in Montana this year?
If you're talking about the water issue,
any of them, yeah, the water one.
Well, I am not in favor of the minimum wage initiative that's being discussed. That's a state
Either on the
initiative.
state or the federal
No.
level?
Yes.
Opposed to an
yeah.
increase in a minimum
And I have
wage.
not, and my reason for that is simply this, is that Montanans need to have more job opportunities and we need better paying jobs. Raising the minimum wage isn't the way to accomplish that. All it does is take those people that are most at risk and puts them in jeopardy of having a job altogether. Clearly raising the minimum wage will reduce the number of jobs. The question is whose job gets lost, and it's usually the people that are at the margin, the people with the least amount of skills. And ironically, we're at a time where everybody in America is talking about taking people off from public assistance programs, off from welfare systems, and trying to work them into the workplace. And we're working at cross purposes with those two objectives, and I feel badly about that. What we do need is more job opportunities on that job ladder, and there are public policy decisions that we can make to accomplish that, both in Montana and Washington, and I'm in favor of doing that and creating more opportunity. After all, 80% of the people who start a minimum wage job 6 months later are not earning the minimum wage. It's the people who end up getting trapped there that we need to worry about. And the way you get those people off in the minimum wage is to give them more job skills.
What industries do you think, Montana it could not be considered one of the strongest states economically in terms of job opportunities and things like that. What kinds of industries do you think could be attracted to Montana?
You know, McCarthy, my view, I came to Montana. I wasn't born and raised here, although my grandfather lived here and was a miner and a prospector. I came here after college. And I came to Montana because I saw it as a place full of opportunity, and it's rewarded me very generously. I still see Montana as a place full of opportunity. 93% of the people who work in Montana work for a business that's located here that has 50 or less employees. If we're going to have a more progressive, prosperous economy, it's going to come from the expansion and the growth of those businesses. A lot of people say, well, we'll just attract some industry to come and transplant to Montana. We have a lot of obstacles to that in terms of public policy obstacles. But those public policy obstacles are also putting barriers for the businesses that are here from growing. That's one of the things I understand because I'm a businessman and I've worked with literally hundreds of Montana businesses. I've worked with the university system and helping develop research, taking it from the laboratory into the marketplace and actually creating businesses and industries around it, McCarthy.
Right.
And the fact is that the opportunities are here if we stop thinking about ourselves like a third world economy. This is not, there's no reason, we have a very productive labor force, we have a skilled labor force, we have hardworking labor force. We have some public policy attitudes towards industry that's embedded in some of our attitudes in terms of our environmental policy, our attitudes towards relationship between management and labor, our tax policy with regard to how we tax business personal property, the investment that creates jobs, that we need to change in Montana.
Well, in talking about that, you were talking about, you know, seeking, you know, less public expenditure. Butte, you know, like other places, but Butte always seems to be in the news as they, you know, offer tax breaks and they get government grants, and and you can tell me what your approach to that, but I wanted to mention that you also yourself were involved with what the Montana technology, what is that?
Science and Technology Alliance.
Science and Technology, right?
Yes.
Now that's, there's public money involved in that, right?
Yes.
And you were, I assume, part and parcel from time to time in seeing how these public monies got spent or invested, right?
Invested,
Right. So you do. So there's another part of you that says you do see a role then for investment by the government of public tax funds into research in the private sector.
Absolutely. And let me make
well,
this. Let me clarify this for you too, because I think it's really important. Is that one of the things that Montana has lacked is investment capital, domestically produced, domestically invested investment capital, not loans, not grants, capital available for investment. The state of Montana has about $5 billion in its various accounts that it has invested.
Right.
That money is invested in stocks and bonds,
Right.
treasury notes, all different kinds of investment vehicles, none oriented to the state of Montana. What MSTA did is create a venture capital fund, a commonly used investment tool that takes some of the state of Montana's dollars and invest it as investment capital in ventures in Montana, particularly technology-oriented businesses, hopefully businesses oriented to taking research from our university system, put it in the marketplace. Do I think that they ought to invest those dollars? Absolutely, I do. Now, also the legislature gave MSTA authority to take some of those coal tax dollars and use it to invest in the commercialization of technologies that were being developed in our research institutions. And I think that's a good idea, too. So I'm in favor of, we have a pool of investment dollars, less invested in Montana rather than in Wall Street. I'm all in favor of that. But those weren't grants. That's not money that was given away. Those were investments that you'd have just like any other investment.
Rick, we're just about out of time, and I'll just give you a minute to say what you want or need to say. And I appreciate your coming down to Missoula Community Access Television and speaking with us. So it's yours for a minute.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your having me here. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with the people in Missoula. You have a wonderful community here. Throughout this campaign, what I have said to the people of Montana, that I think it's time that someone in Congress had the experience of running a business, that understood what it's like to meet a payroll, understood what it's like to pay taxes and deal with government regulation on a day-to-day basis, know how hard it is to create a job in Montana. And that's the experience I would bring to this office. And I think it's time for Montana to have that kind of leadership in Washington. My goals are to increase the living standard and the earning capacity of the people who live and work in Montana, to make the small businesses in Montana more prosperous, the people who work in them more prosperous, and I'd appreciate your vote on June 4th. Thank you very much.
We've been talking with Rick Hill, and again, thanks very much for coming down.
Thank you. All right. Good interview. Are we done?
We're done.